From Congress, the President of Peru, Pedro Castillo, lifted the mandatory social lockout that was in effect in Lima and Callao, decreed in the midst of the transporters' strike. The United Nations Security Council meets to address the allegations of killings of civilians in the town of Bucha, Ukraine, by Western media. The South African government ended the national state of disaster and lifted several anti-COVID-19 measures. Hi, this is From the South. I am your news anchor, Dio Martin, from the teleSUR studios in Havana. We begin with the news. Peruvian President Pedro Castillo announced a revocation of the order of immovability at the end of his meeting with the legislative branch's board of directors. Castillo reaffirmed the willingness of the executive branch to talk and work together with the other branches of the republic upon leaving the legislative palace. He also announced his decision to repeal the mobility restriction order, among other measures that will be informed later on. Recently, the South American country has registered days of protests by transporters in rejection of the increase of the price of fuel.
We participated, we listened to the spokespersons and to the Congress of the Republic. In this understanding, it is up to us as the executive to tell the Congress what we're doing. And at this moment, we're moving to the office to sign and leave without effect the measure of inamobility. And it corresponds at this moment to also make some important announcements that we're waiting to make together with the Congress of the Republic.
During the meeting with the spokespersons of the Congress, President Castillo confirmed his respect for the right of Peruvians to protest. However, he asserted that as a state, they will not endorse violent attitudes that violate the Constitution.
We believe it is important that the powers of the states are there to serve the country, and to the extent that we are here to safeguard the lives of all our countrymen, when a measure is taken and waiting for the attitude and the right that Peruvians and citizens have to demonstrate as a right, that does not mean that taking advantage of a mobilization or constitutional right, we as the state also endorse some attitude that go beyond the constitutional right, such as blocking roads, such as throwing stones, for example, at a house, private property, attacking private property in public institutions and private institutions.
Meanwhile, in the surroundings of the Legislative Palace, there were confrontations between state security forces and demonstrators protesting against the administration of President Pedro Castillo. Police officers tried to disperse the demonstration by firing tear gas, to which the protesters responded with stones. We must remember that the worsening of the conflict occurred as a response to the carriers' disagreements with the preliminary settlement resulting from the meetings with the government within the framework of the carriers' strike. In Ecuador, the government informed that it will have the support from different international entities to face the conflicts of violence, insecurity, and drug trafficking. On Tuesday, President Guillermo Lasso acknowledged that it will take time to control the situation of violence in the country. However, he indicated that with the help of several governments, it will be possible to overcome the situation generated by national and international criminal gangs involved in drug trafficking. The head of state added that the decision to seek the contribution of other governments was taken after the April 3rd riot in a prison in the south of the country, which left at least 20 people dead. Lasso did not rule out as a possible solution to the problem of prison violence the construction of another maximum security prison with modern technology. And indigenous people celebrate the second day of the 18th edition of the Freeland Camp outside Congress in Brasilia. The largest indigenous mobilization in Brazil, where people from all over the country come to defend the rights of ancestral communities and to reject the advance in Congress of bills proposed by the ultra-right-wing government of Jair Bolsonaro, who pursues to open up indigenous territories to mining activities. The Freeland Camp began on April 4th and runs until April 14th. The organizers expect to mobilize between 7,000 and 8,000 indigenous people from all over the nation.
Today, there are several bills in Congress that open up indigenous territories to mining, and also the Draft Law 191 today strengthens these advances within our territories. And this act here is to say no, that these bills cannot move forward. The Amazon is discussed a lot, the preservation of the environment, the preservation of the rivers, but one thing is not discussed. It is the preservation of the lives of the people who live in the Amazon. who live in this country, and especially this indigenous population that is responsible today for keeping alive the biodiversity of this country. The Amazon is not just green, it is not just a river, the Amazon is us.
The Argentinian government announced the implementation of a coupon to counteract the loss of purchasing power following the inflation's impact. The authorities explained that minimum wage retirees and pensioners will collect the additional 6,000 peso bonus, equivalent to $52, as an aid to face the country's inflation and, in particular, the increase in food prices. The head of the National Social Security Administration, Fernanda Raberta, said the payment of the coupon will benefit 4.6 million retirees and pensioners. The money will begin to be deposited in their regular accounts as from April 18th on an ID number-based order. In Guatemala, civil, indigenous, and peasant organizations called for 3 days of protests in several parts of the country against corruption. Groups of indigenous and peasant organizations protested on Tuesday in front of the public prosecutor's office in rejection of corruption, the high cost of gasoline, the basic food basket, and a possible re-election of the Attorney General Consuelo Porras for her links with politicians accused of corruption, criminalizing justice operators, human rights defenders, and journalists. The protesters announced that the protests will extend for 3 consecutive days and that there is a presence of protesters in at least 20 prosecutors' offices all over the country, while demanding the authorities to end the support to businesses and businessmen. We're going to take a short break now. Please join us again after this. Hi, and welcome back to From the South. The United Nations Security Council met to address the alleged killing of civilians in the town of Bucha, Ukraine. During today's debate, the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, requested an independent investigation into the events in the city of Bucha. Meanwhile, the representative of the government of Russia, Vasily Nebenzia, rejected the veto made by the United Kingdom on 2 occasions against the intention of carrying out this discussion in the Security Council. The official also denounced that neo-Nazi groups operating in Ukraine are attacking civilians and using them as human shields amid the special military operation carried out by Moscow in the Donbass region.
And they're not just killing Russian or prisoner soldiers, in which they torture and gloat about it on the social media, but they kill their own. Your neo-Nazis and radicals have shown unrivaled cruelty against the civilians, which they use as human shields, and position heavy artillery next to residential buildings and multiple rocket launchers as well. Today we've heard once again a huge amount of lies about Russian soldiers and military. We have hundreds, if not thousands, of video testimonials of people who are ready to provide testimony about the cruelty of Ukrainian nationals.
Nebenzia also warned that Ukrainian authorities manipulated audiovisual material related to the events in the city of Bucha.
Already after the withdrawal of the Russian forces, the mayor of Bucha, Anatoly Fedoruk, in his video statement on the 31st of March, presented this as a heroic liberation of the city by the Ukrainian armed forces. Now, let's set aside its so-called liberation, and let's focus on the fact that he confirmed the fact on the 31st of March that there were no more Russian soldiers in the town on the 31st of March. Furthermore, the mayor did not mention any local inhabitants with their hands tied and having been shot. I mean, could you believe that the mayor would not have noticed on the streets, as reported, of 280 corpses? He wouldn't have noticed that?
Addressing the Security Council, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky questioned the United Nations security guarantees. At the same time, the permanent representative of the Russian Federation to the UN, Vasily Nebenzia, warned on inaccuracies in Ukrainian and Western versions of Bucha events.
So where is the security that the Security Council needs to guarantee? It's not there, although there is a Security Council. Where is that peace? Where are those guarantees that the United Nations needs to guarantee? It is obvious that the key institution of the world, which must ensure the coercion of any aggression to peace, simply cannot work effectively. And now we're seeing blatant criminally staged events with the Ukrainian civilians that were killed by the radicals in the best traditions of Goebbels to accuse the Russian army. Those killed in the areas from which the Russian forces withdrew after encouraging peace negotiations in Istanbul. Now it turns out that we shouldn't have withdrawn. I'm talking about Bucha first and foremost. I understand that you were shown courses and heard testimonies, but you have only saw what they have shown you. You cannot ignore the inconsistencies in the version of events which are being promoted by the Ukrainian and Western media.
Russia's ambassador to the United Nations, Vasily Nebenzia, said on Tuesday in New York that the number of evacuees from Ukraine to Russia is far greater than the figures provided by the United Nations.
I'm not going to overload you with figures. Such communications are published every single day by our Ministry of Defense. I would like to say that just out of Mariupol, toward the east, without any participation by the Ukrainian side, we have managed to save 123,500 people. Now overall, since the beginning of the special military operation, over 600,000 people have been evacuated to Russia, including over 119,000 children. And we're not talking about any kind of coercion or abduction as our Western partners like to present this, but rather the voluntary decision by these people, as testified by many videos that are accessible in social media. We came to you, to Ukraine, not to conquer land. We came to bring the long-awaited peace to the blood-soaked land of Donbass. Not a truce, but a true lasting peace, and for this we need to root out the cruelty which I mentioned. We need to cut out the malignant Nazi tumor that is consuming Ukraine and would in time begin to consume Russia. And we will achieve that goal, I hope sooner rather than later, because there is no other outcome.
The Russian embassy in the United States denounced on that the West is trying to demonize the armed forces of its country with false accusations about the events in the Ukrainian city of Bucha. Russian diplomat Anatoly Antonov pointed out that the provocation in Bucha is a height of lies and cynicism and emphasized that the White House appointed responsible without evidence of the alleged war crimes. Antonov urged the U.S. diplomats to pay attention to the events in Bucha and to stop their criminal differentiation from the actions of the Russian soldiers and neo-Nazi groups operating in Ukraine and continuing to blockade civilians in Ukrainian cities. He also reminded that the Russian forces increase the humanitarian aid in the controlled areas and ensure the safety of the humanitarian corridors. On Tuesday, President Vladimir Putin condemned the measures taken against Russian gas giant Gazprom in Europe over the conflict in Ukraine and warned of potential reprisals. Putin addressed officials in a televised meeting after Germany said on Monday it was temporarily taking control of Gazprom's German subsidiary.
The situation in the energy sector is worsening as a result of non-market brute measures, including administrative pressure on our company Gazprom in some European countries. We are already hearing statements from officials about the possible nationalization of our assets. If we go that far, let's not forget that this is a double-edged sword.
We have more news coming up after one final short break. Please stay with us. Welcome back. In South Africa, local authorities ended the national state of disaster, the legal framework used for 2 years to impose restrictions to combat the pandemic. According to the President Cyril Ramaphosa, most restrictions will be lifted, but people will be required to wear masks in indoor public spaces, and international travelers must provide proof of vaccination or a negative PCR test done within 72 hours. Opposition parties, which were pressuring the government to lift the state of disaster, welcomed the decision. It was also supported by the businesses and tourism sector, saying it would pave the way for the country's economic recovery after it lost an estimated 2 million jobs during the pandemic. Long vehicle lines stretched outside fuel stations in Kenya on Tuesday as the country's fuel crisis showed no signs of subsiding. The government had reportedly agreed to pay the equivalent of $113 million to oil companies to keep prices down and inflation under control. Government officials, including Kenya's President Uhuru Kenyatta, promised Monday to approve a supplementary budget to pay for the fuel subsidy and ease the shortages. However, by Tuesday, frustrated motorists were still lining up outside gas stations across the country. The fuel shortage is believed to have been caused by the government's failing to pay subsidies to help stabilize fuel prices.
Yeah, fuel is food, fuel is everything, fuel is cool, fuel is almost running everything. Actually, not almost, but without fuel, what will you run?
Even if the war in Ukraine is a contributor, we hear a lot of fuel comes from either Russia or Ukraine, but together with those, we have enough reserves. We have reserves, and if I am not forgetting, we have our own fuel as Kenyans, which we are proud of. But we believe in a short while before things get too bad, the president will direct the release of that fuel.
West Africa faces its worst food crisis in a decade due to increasing conflicts, droughts, floods, and the conflict in Ukraine, according to what international organizations reported on Tuesday. The report said the number of West Africans needing emergency food assistance has increased from 7 million in 2015 to 27 million this year in nations including Burkina Faso, Niger, Chad, Mali, and Nigeria, where thousands were displaced because of rising Islamic extremist violence. Drought and poor rainfall distribution have reduced sources in the central Sahel region, and food prices increased by up to 30%. According to Salama Dawalak Sidi, Oxfam's regional director for West and Central Africa, cereal production in some parts of the Sahel has dropped by about a third compared to last year. Sidi said another important driver was a crisis in Ukraine.
It's an alert to the world. We're witnessing right now 27 million people in West Africa who are affected by what we could consider the worst food crisis from the past 10 years. And if nothing is done, 11 million more people will join this group, making it to 38 million people who would be affected. Another important driver that is new is the crisis in Ukraine. 6 out of the 12 countries where Oxfam operates in West Africa import their wheat from Ukraine or Russia, and because of this crisis, in Ukraine, this is no more possible. And if they cannot import wheat, that means it's creating shortage in the food available in the countries, and therefore, increasing the prices and making it very difficult for people to afford food.
A 2-month truce brokered by the United Nations in Yemen gives hope to people as they continue to struggle for survival. Many fear the latest ceasefire in the 7-year-old conflict, coinciding with the start of the Muslim holy month of Ramadan, will only silence the guns temporarily. Yemen is the poorest country in the Arab world and hit by what the United Nations called the world's worst humanitarian crisis, with 80% of the country's 30 million people now dependent on aid. The civil war killed hundreds of thousands, displaced millions, and pushed Yemen to the brink of famine. The latest truce went into effect Saturday with the possibility for an extension beyond the 2 months, but 3 days later the warring parties already traded accusations of ceasefire violations. Palestinian human rights organizations confirmed that young people under 18 suffer all kinds of abuse by Israeli occupation forces. Ayed Abu Kutaish, director of the Accountability Program at the International Movement to Defend Children, said the Israeli occupation killed 5 underage this year in the occupied territories and 160 were arrested. Hassan Abdrabo, an official in the media department of the mentioned movement, said that Palestinian children are subject to continuous physical and verbal abuses at the hands of the occupation forces from the beginning of the arrest process. They are deprived of legal assistance through a lawyer or the presence of a guardian during interrogation sessions and are forced to sign documents that they do not understand, which are used as evidence of their accusation in the occupation courts. With that, we've come to the end of this news brief. Remember, you can find these and many other stories on our website at teleSUR English. You can also join us on social media for all the latest news. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Telegram. For teleSUR English, I am Dio Martin. Thanks for watching.